Mount Hermon is Israel's highest peak, rising more than 9,000 feet. It not only extends into this northern section of Israel, but also into Syria and Lebanon. Here on its foothills is where Caesarea Philippi lies, receiving the runoff from the winter snows on the mountain. The water literally flows out of this rocky cliff. Jesus brought his disciples here in order to teach them an unforgettable object lesson. Archaeologists have made some incredible discoveries here. Let's head up to the cavern and get a closer look. This foundation was once the site of an Egyptian temple. Next to it, somewhat sunken due to an earthquake 400 years ago, was a Roman temple. And down below, we see another foundation, this one an ancient Greek temple. Just behind this Greek foundation is this large cavern where the Greeks would sacrifice animals to their pagan god, Pan, in thanks for the life-giving water that flows from here. In the very back of the cavern, until the earthquake years ago, there was a deep abyss where the animals would be sacrificed. The Greeks believed the abyss reached the place of the dead, or Hades, which is why this cavern became known as the Gates of Hades, bringing even more meaning to today's scripture lesson. This niche, hand-carved into the rock, is one of many found along this wall. It's also a place where over the years, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Egyptians have all stored their false stone gods. This is also a place where Jesus brought his followers, and he asked them an important question: who do people say that I am? And then he makes it more personal and asks, who do you say that I am? Peter speaks up and declares, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. As we'll see in this lesson, Peter was beginning to recognize just who Jesus Christ was, the Son of the living God. And it happened right here in front of these dead stone idols.
When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples,
"Who do people say the Son of Man is?"
They replied,
"Some say John the Baptist,
Others say Elijah,
and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets."
"But what about you?
He asked.
Who do you say I am?"
Simon Peter answered,
You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Jesus replied,
"Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him.
Never, Lord,
He said.
this shall never happen to you.
Jesus turned and said to Peter,
"Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men."
Then Jesus said to his disciples,
"If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth. Some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
I'm in Vulture City. It's an old gold mine outside of Phoenix, Arizona, discovered back in 1863. Over $200 million worth of gold and silver were taken out of this mine. At one point, 5,000 people live here. It's now deserted, but as I walk around here, I can see the mines, the blacksmith's shop, even the founder, Henry Wickenburg's old cabin. The hanging tree is still here where 18 people were hung for stealing gold. And probably my favorite building is the assay building, where they separated the gold from the impurities. It's estimated the walls of this building, which is built from low-grade gold and silver ore, is worth more than $600,000. People came to Vulture City hoping to find gold. I'm sitting right next to the ramp that leads down into the original mine. It goes down 3,000 feet. There's over 32 miles of mines underneath the ground around here. People came to try to find gold so they could live the good life. You know, people are still trying to do that. They're working hard in the corporate world, trying to climb the corporate ladder so that they can live large, live the good life, have power. Well, Jesus was enticed with power too. In fact, after he fed the 5,000, the crowd, that large crowd, wanted to make him king by force. Jesus rejected that offer, and he went up onto a mountain to pray all by himself. Jesus had no interest in power and money and prestige, at least the way we understand those terms. Jesus had a very different plan for himself and for his followers. Well, we're in Matthew chapter 16 today. 16 chapters Jesus has been teaching and preaching, casting out demons, healing, and he wants to know the word on the street. So he asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And his disciples say, well, some say that you're John the Baptist. Some people thought that he was John the Baptist who had been brought back from the dead. But others say that you're Elijah. Elijah was an Old Testament prophet who never died. In fact, he was taken alive right up into heaven in a whirlwind. The prophet Malachi said that Elijah someday would return. And in fact, today, still, Jewish people at Passover dinner, they will leave an empty chair at the table so that just in case Elijah comes back, he can sit there. The disciples continued and said, others think Jeremiah or maybe one of the prophets. You see, because of Deuteronomy 18:18, where God says that he would raise up a prophet like Moses, the Jewish people were looking forward to a new prophet. Maybe Jesus was that new prophet. And they hoped so because since Malachi, the very last prophet in the Old Testament, there was no prophetic voice in Israel. So they were hoping that Jesus was a prophet, hoping that Jesus would be the one who would speak the very words of God to them. So they're attributing to Jesus great status. They think he's someone very special. But as great as these titles are, it's not enough. So Jesus now turns to his disciples and he says, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And these yous here are plural, so we have to translate them as my mom would do. She's from the South. What about y'all? Who do y'all say that I am? And Peter steps up. He's the spokesman for the disciples. And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Good job, Peter. Way to go. Peter got it right. Peter shows that the disciples are beginning to understand that Jesus is much more than just a prophet, that he is the Christ, the Messiah. what does Christ mean? Well, Christ is exactly the same as the Hebrew word Messiah. They mean the same thing. They both mean anointed one. In the Old Testament, priests were anointed, kings were anointed, even prophets were anointed. You might remember that King David was anointed by the prophet Samuel. So David was a Messiah. He was an anointed one. But as time went on, the Jewish people thought less in anointed ones, in messiahs, plural, and more in the anointed one, or the Messiah. Jewish expectations for the Messiah or for the Christ were varied. Some expected a priest, others a prophet, but most expected a king like King David, who would come like King David did, and he would fight against the foreigners, the pagans in the land, which means in the time of Jesus that he would be fighting against the Romans to set Israel free. Here's a sample text from the time of Jesus that shows this point. Here's what they wrote. They said, "See, Lord, and raise up for them their king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel. Undergird him with the strength to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction." So because the Jews meant such different things when they used this term Christ, we shouldn't assume that Peter fully understands the term Christ when he uses that term, at least the way that you and I would understand this term. As Jesus continues on ministering, Peter will slowly understand exactly what kind of Messiah Jesus is. Jesus' response to Peter's confession is pretty cool. Here's what he says in our text in Matthew 16. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." In Aramaic, the language that Jesus was probably speaking, Peter and rock are exactly the same word. In Greek, they're very similar, Petros and Petra. So Jesus is saying, you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. So what Jesus is saying to Peter is that Peter will be the leader among the apostles, that he will play a foundational role as the church is built up. And this is exactly what we see in the book of Acts. When they're picking the replacement for Judas, who betrayed Jesus, it's Peter who takes the lead. On the day of Pentecost, it's Peter who preaches the sermon. When they go off to Samaria to check on the extension of the church there, it's Peter who leads the way. And it's Peter who talks to Cornelius, the very first Greek convert to the gospel. The next phrase, "and the gates of Hades will not overcome the church," is a little bit difficult to interpret. The gates of, in first century Jewish literature, means the power of. And Hades was the location of the dead. So Jesus probably is saying that the power of death will not overcome the church. In other words, even though Peter and the apostles and many in the early church are martyred, they're killed for their faith, the church will still continue to grow. Death cannot stop the church, and that's true. But it's also possible to interpret it in a different way. Hades was the location of the dead, but it was especially known in the first century as the location of the ungodly dead, of Satan, and even of demons. And if this is the case, then what Jesus is saying is that all the powers of the ungodly dead, all the powers of Satan and his demons cannot overcome the church. No matter how much power Satan has, he cannot stop the church from growing. And that, of course, is true also. Jesus then tells Peter something else in our text. He says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, the words binding and loosing were used in Jewish literature for the rabbis when they were interpreting the law of Moses, determining right and wrong. So what Jesus is probably telling Peter is that he will not only be the leader of the apostles in helping to build up the church, but he will also be the leader in interpreting the law of Moses now through the lens of Jesus' life, so that the early church knows how to interpret right and wrong as new Christians, as new believers in Jesus the Messiah. As a result of his teaching and preaching, Peter Jesus says, has the keys of the kingdom. That's right. Peter has the keys of the kingdom. He can open up the gate and let people in to the kingdom of God, or he can keep the gate shut. He has the keys. Now, of course, we have to be really careful here. Peter isn't the way into the kingdom. Jesus, of course, is the way into the kingdom. But Peter has the keys. So what does this mean? Well, I think what it means is that when Peter preaches the gospel, he opens the gate. He has the keys to open the gate, to let people into the kingdom of heaven when they respond to his preaching. And that's what we see on the day of Pentecost. In fact, when he preaches on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people respond to his message about Jesus and are let in to the gates of the kingdom. So it's true that Peter has the keys, but really it's true that each of us, all Christians, have the keys to the kingdom. As we preach, as we teach, as we speak to people about Jesus, we have the keys to open the gate and let them in to heaven. Boy, what a great privilege. God uses us to let people into the kingdom of heaven. But what a big responsibility, too. The section ends with Jesus commanding the disciples not to tell anybody that he's the Christ. You see, the crowds also would misunderstand that term. They also were expecting a king who would come and fight against the Romans, so Jesus couldn't use that title. It's just too dangerous. So the title of Christ or Messiah basically disappears until the trial of Jesus, when it's brought up again. Well, now we come to verse 21. This is a very, very important verse. Perhaps it's even the most important verse in the Gospel of Matthew. It says this, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer, die, and be raised from the dead." The word must can also be translated, it is necessary. And behind this necessity is God. God says that it's necessary. So Jesus must go to Jerusalem because God wants that to happen. God wants Jesus to suffer and die in some way. Now, this is a turning point in the gospel. From here on out in the gospel, the theme of Jesus' death will be the main theme. Well, Peter, he knows his Jewish messianic expectations. So he calls Jesus aside. He's going to correct Jesus here. And he tells him, Jesus, you have it all backwards. The Messiah doesn't suffer and die. The Messiah makes other people suffer and die. Well, Jesus is not happy with Peter. He says to him, get behind me, Satan. You see, Satan's goal is to oppose whatever God's will is. And if God's will is for Jesus to go to the cross, then Peter is serving Satan's desires here. Peter the rock has become the stumbling stone. Peter doesn't get it. None of the disciples get it. And you know, a lot of people, when they read this, they're a bit confused by that. How could they not get it? How could they not understand that Jesus was going to go suffer and die? I mean, we've seen the movie, The Passion of the Christ. We've read Isaiah 53. How could they miss it? But it's important to understand that not a single Jewish person in the first century would have interpreted Isaiah 53 this way. None of them thought that Jesus or any Messiah would come and suffer and die. So it's no surprise at all that the disciples didn't get it. But as soon as I say that, I have to add something real quickly. You see, there are Old Testament texts that talk about a Messiah who would come and who would suffer and die. Texts like Isaiah 53, which says this, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So the disciples didn't get it, but there were Old Testament texts that talked about the Messiah who would suffer and die and take the sins of the world upon him. It's no surprise that the disciples didn't get it. They didn't even get it after the resurrection. If you look at the book of Acts in chapter 1, after the resurrection, they say to Jesus, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" In other words, they're saying to Jesus, you know, we didn't really think you were going to suffer and die. And that resurrection thing, man, that was cool. We didn't expect that either. But Jesus, you've had your fun. Can we now restore the kingdom to Israel? Can we now go fight the Romans and bring freedom? They still don't get it. And Jesus says to them, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you can just imagine the disciples going, power. Yeah, power to fight the Romans. You'll receive power, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, all the way to the ends of the earth. And you can almost see the disciples going, witness. Did he say witnesses or did he say warriors? No, he said witnesses. What in the world is going on? As if that wasn't a big enough surprise for the disciples, Jesus has one more. He tells them, if anyone is going to follow me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. In other words, Jesus is telling the disciples, boys, I'm going to Jerusalem to suffer and die, but guess what? You're coming with me. You too are going to take up your cross and suffer and die right along with me. I can just imagine the disciples when they heard this. They had signed up to go with the Messiah who would reign. They probably thought they were going to reign with him, not suffer with him. Jesus will suffer and he will die, but that's not the end of the story. He also says in this passage that he will be raised from the dead, and later on in the passage he says that he will return in his Father's glory. You see, Jesus is the Messiah. He is powerful. He can overthrow Rome. But Jesus has a bigger enemy in mind than Rome. Jesus wants to fight Satan and overthrow Satan. That is Jesus' enemy. Jesus has bigger plans. Jesus came to overthrow Satan and the power of sin. You see, Jesus isn't going to take up arms against Rome. Jesus is going to stretch his own arms out on a Roman cross. Jesus wants to set people free, but not just Israel from Roman oppression. Jesus wants to set the whole world free from the oppression of Satan and sin. But to do this, he must go to the cross, suffer, die, and be raised. The disciples have no idea what Jesus is saying. They don't understand. But they know that they can trust Jesus, and that's enough for them. This passage has some really, really great applications that will totally and radically change our lives if we'll just let them. And the first application is this: God will build his church. Peter knew that Jesus was the Christ because the Father had revealed it to him. Well, the Father continues to reveal Jesus to people today, and the church continues to grow. We can be encouraged, totally encouraged, that nothing can stop the church from growing. Not even death, not even all the powers of Satan. God will build his church. From way back in Genesis, when he called Abraham and said, I will multiply your offspring like the sand of the seashore, all the way to the book of Revelation, where we see that God will gather people into his kingdom from every tribe, every language, every tongue. God will build his church. The second application is that this passage teaches us who Jesus is, who he really is. You see, he's greater than all the greats of the past, greater than John the Baptist and Elijah and Jeremiah and all the prophets. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of Man who will come in the glory of the Father. Do we understand that? You see, some people today say that Jesus is a great teacher, or maybe he's a great prophet. But do we understand who he really and fully is? If we do, the next application will be a little bit easier to accept. The third application is this. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, he must take up his cross, deny himself, and follow me. And we sometimes forget that the cross in the first century was an instrument of death. So Jesus is basically saying, if you're going to follow me, you need to die. And Luke's parallel to this passage says, daily. So die daily. That's what it means to follow Jesus. Doesn't that sound like a lot of fun? Denying myself means that I take myself off of the throne, put me to the side, and take Jesus and put him on the throne every single day. Every thought, every decision, every plan, it all must go through Jesus and what He would want. All of my dreams, all of my time, all of my talents, my treasures, all of them must be laid down right before the throne of Jesus to let Him do with them as He wants. This seems to be the opposite of what we hear in our world today, where people are always trying to strike it rich and get more and more and more. Even sitting here in a gold mine reminds us of that. I mean, why did people come out into the middle of the desert? There's not even any water here except to find gold, so that they could then live the good life. Well, Jesus redefines the good life. The good life now is found in sacrificially dying to myself so that I am able to serve God and serve others. That is what the good life is. You know, it's funny, ironically funny, we tell our missionaries to sacrifice so that they can go across to other cultures and preach the gospel. And yet we don't hear very often that those of us who stay here should also sacrifice so that we can share the gospel with our neighbors, with our communities, and maybe even to help support those missionaries that go across to other countries. The guy who discipled me told me long ago that we need to live more simply so that others can simply live. I really like what college basketball coach Ron Hunter did in Indiana in 2008. He coached an entire game barefoot in order to raise awareness for the millions of children in the world who don't have any shoes. He was able to raise and send overseas more than 400,000 pairs of shoes to help the needy. Now, I know that this is hard. It's hard to sacrificially live so that we can help other people. It's much easier to look around us and, whoa, look at that car. Maybe I need a new car. Look at that pair of shoes or that dress, or maybe I need a little more jewelry. But Jesus asks us to sacrifice so that we can serve other people. Besides, all the good things, so-called good things that we could accumulate, they don't go with us after we die. I mean, I'm sitting here in a gold mine. $200 million worth of gold was taken out, but none of it went with the miners when they died. It was all gone. Imagine, just imagine what would happen if every single Christian in the world decided that they were going to begin to deny themselves, to die every single day so that they could serve God but also serve other people. Imagine what would happen in our communities and throughout the world as a church really took Jesus seriously. Boy, it would transform our churches. Our fourth application simply asks a question. Is it worth it? I mean, dying to ourselves, is it worth it? And I guess the simple answer is that God is worthy, so it's worth it. I mean, as Darrell Evans sings, "You are worthy, so I'll give you nothing less than everything." But let's be honest, we're human. If I'm going to deny myself, is it really worth it? And besides, our text in Matthew 16 mentions a reward, so I guess it's worth talking about it for a little while. Well, is it worth it? And I think the answer is very simple. Yes, it's worth it. In fact, we see in this passage that Peter blows it big time, and yet Peter receives forgiveness from Jesus. Jesus doesn't just throw Peter aside and go with plan B, doesn't give up on Peter. He forgives him. How do we know that he forgives him? Well, the very next passage after this, Peter goes up onto the mountain and sees the transfiguration of Jesus. He gets a glimpse of Jesus' glory. Jesus is continuing on with Peter. He forgives him. And we too can be forgiven. And forgiveness is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But not only forgiveness, there are many other rewards that we can have here on earth. Things like joy, things like peace, things like community with other people, that we can love, really love with a Christian love. But I did want to mention one other reward. It's the retirement plan that Jesus offers. You see, Jesus says at the end of this text, He says, "For the Son of Man is going to come in His Father's glory with His angels, and then He will reward each person according to what he has done." Talk about a retirement plan. Eternal rewards from Jesus. I guess that makes it worth it. You know, recently read an article in the paper about a woman in Orange County. She worked 12 to 15 hours a day, and to reward herself, she bought herself jewelry. She had amassed over $500,000 worth of jewelry. And in one night, a thief came and he stole it all. $500,000 gone. In the blink of an eye, it was all gone. We, when we serve God and serve others, denying ourselves, we work for eternal rewards where no thief can come and take it away from us. Though Jesus now reigns in heaven, when he was on earth, he suffered and he died. I try to imagine the thousands of people who came to this gold mine hunting for gold. You know, they came over, they faced disease, they didn't have enough food probably, they didn't have any water here in the desert, and yet they thought that it was worth it in order to get gold. In fact, I'm just sitting a couple hundred feet away from a huge sinkhole where 7 men wanted to find a little more gold, so they started digging in one of the support columns. And it caved in on them, and it set off a series of cave-ins. And now it's just a huge sinkhole. The 7 men and 12 mules died trying to get some gold, but they thought it was worth it. Well, I wonder if we Christians think it's worth it. See, they were trying to get gold, but we are serving God. And I wonder if we think it's worth it to sacrificially take up our cross and follow Jesus, leaving behind desires for power and wealth and prestige. Not searching for gold, but something much more valuable than gold. As 1 Peter says in chapter 1, verse 6 and 7, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." May Jesus Christ be glorified when we sacrificially take up our cross and follow Him by serving other people.